This is sort of a warning. This is a new project. In a way, I started it several years back when I had to just teach my undergraduate class something about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And I wanted to talk to them about how it works and why we should defer to it, to the findings based on how it works. And what I had a hard time trying to figure out from materials that were available is what was meant in the IPCC by consensus. So I thought I could just email somebody that had been involved in the IPCC and ask them what was meant by consensus. So I sent off an email to Mike Hulme, whose book, Why We Disagree About Climate Change, had recently come out, and just said, what's meant by consensus? I have to lecture on this tomorrow, basically. And he emailed back that, well, that's a big question. The short answer is that consensus is what the IPCC does. Many scientists have staked their career and reputation on this, and politicians have believed them. Well, that was interesting, but it was a useless answer, of course. So I just went ahead and did my best with the procedures and protocols of the IPCC the next day, and I dropped the issue. Let's see, that was 2010 until this last summer, and then started looking into it again. As important as consensus is, it's not at all straightforward what it means. As for its importance, it takes consensus among voters to get lawmakers elected. It takes consensus among lawmakers to get laws enacted. It's often said or argued that consensus among scientists is what justifies deference to their claims about the world. Short of consensus, we don't know whom to believe. But what is consensus? Use of the term covers a variety of phenomena as diverse as political consensus on the one hand and scientific on the other. But it's not that sort of difference that I want to emphasize here. Rather, I'm concerned with differences that cut across politics, science, and other activities. We commonly associate consensus with some form of counting, vote tallying, opinion polling, adding up the number of authors that endorse a particular position in their published papers, which still leaves open the question whether the count in question indicates consensus in the sense of unanimity or majority or something in between. In this case, it indicates 97.1% consensus on anthropogenic global warming. But even these important differences in proportion are not the ones I want to emphasize here. Nor do I have in mind the many complications with counting itself. What's being counted as what, who's doing the counting, and so on. The environmental economist and statistician Richard Toll has severely criticized the methodology of this paper, concluding that the proportion may well be correct, but it must be a coincidence that the authors arrived at it given their methodology. There are many reasons why we might wonder what proportion is signified by the term consensus, or even what some specific proportion like 97% signifies, but that's not what concerns me here either. Rather, I'm interested in a form of consensus that's less aggregative, less based on counting, and more collective. And for now, I'll just point to the brief and somewhat exaggerated, but I would say only somewhat exaggerated description of it by the early Israeli statesman Eban, and a diplomat should know. According to Eban, a consensus means that everyone agrees to say collectively what no one believes individually. Maybe a bit of an exaggeration. This sort of consensus is definitely not just a tally of the individual viewpoints of the members of the group in question. And I think it helps to be aware of this non-aggregative form of consensus so as to avoid assuming that what might seem to be a tallied consensus is not. For example, that what might appear to be, what perhaps is even designed to appear as unanimous consent is not really 100%, nor even close. I say it's important to be aware of these more collective forms of consensus, and yet I feel sure you're somewhat familiar with it or them already, since they are quite widespread as well. the sort of consensus has been described and studied in the British cabinet, Quaker meetings, small village in Sudan, the drug approval committee of the French health ministry, and more. Perhaps you observed it in your own department meetings. To give you a bit more of the gist of it, before elaborating, consider Clyde Kluckhohn and Dorothea Lawton's 1946 study of the Navajo. The native way of deciding an issue, they write, is to discuss it until there's unanimity of opinion, or, meaning something different from unanimity of opinion, until the opposition feels it's no longer worthwhile to urge its point of view. In other words, this form of consensus involves your group, including you, and indeed in part because of you and your silence, subscribing to a position that you personally reject. Now, this form of consensus goes by various names, referring to its various aspects: decision by interpretation, apparent consensus, nemine contradicente, without objection, joint acceptance. What especially concerns me here is the manner in which this form of consensus represents the epistemic state of play, what the community knows about a particular issue, believes about a particular issue, without revealing differences between the community members on this issue. How it results in epistemic ambiguity in this regard. Such a form of consensus can mask considerable disagreement. And so there's really two levels of ambiguity at issue here. The first concerning what consensus means, when you hear that something has been arrived at by consensus, and second, concerning the epistemic ambiguity associated with this particular form of consensus. Now, I'll discuss some contexts and senses in which these sorts of decision procedures are and are not advantageous for groups of deliberators, and I'll raise questions about the contexts and senses in which these kinds of decision procedures are and are not advantageous for those of us on the outside trying to look in. Finally, I'll illustrate differences between such consensus practices and the more commonly recognized, analyzed, aggregative unanimity and majority practices with reference to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which perhaps surprisingly, given the counting of experts that accompanies the release and promotion of their reports, does not take votes. So again, the IPCC does not take votes, which is hardly clear from their reports, press releases, or even their stated procedures. A well-documented example of the form of consensus I have in mind comes from Jörg Steiner and Robert Dorff's study of just 500 disputes that took place at meetings of the Free Democratic Party in Bern, Switzerland. You're thinking, what in the world does this have to do with science? Hopefully, it'll come together. The authors initially expected that each of the outcomes of these 500 disputes would fall into one of three categories: either resolution by majority vote, explicit unanimous agreement, or just putting off the decision until there was a unanimity or a majority. But these categories turned out to leave more than a third of the outcomes unaccounted for. All of these they came to regard as decisions by interpretation, meaning in part that it remains uncertain whether the dissent in the group has vanished or whether it still persists. So over and over, dissenters stopped dissenting, leaving one position unopposed. But did that mean that the initial dissenters really came to agree with the last position standing? Determined seekers of the truth that Steiner and Dorff were, they joined group members at the pub after meetings to see whether debates that ended in the meetings continued on in this informal setting. In short, the arguments did continue. They hadn't been resolved, but the opposition stopped voicing its disagreement. And I'll say more about this in a minute. Steiner and Dorff refer to this as decision by interpretation in order to emphasize the important role of the chair of these kinds of meetings in interpreting that a consensus position has been reached and deciding the appropriate moment to put the question, does anyone object? They list a number of considerations that are going through the minds of the chairs in these kinds of considerations. In these kinds of situations, I could talk about these later, but to me it still seems like there's quite a bit of extrasensory perception involved, some tacit knowledge. And ultimately, it's the group's silence in response to the interpreter's proposal that semi-signals consensus and brings discussion to a close. Sociologist Philippe Orfolino analyzes the Steiner and Dorff study together with a variety of others, including his study of the Drug Approval Committee of the French Ministry of Health, and proposes the concept of what he calls apparent consensus to cover what Steiner and Dorff called decision by interpretation. It's apparent in two respects. First, it's sufficiently apparent to the participant, and not just the chair, that there's a kind of, as he says, collective recognition that the group has reached a point where a particular position faces no further objections. And second, it's apparent in the sense of contrasting it with what's real, as opposed to real, because there may be considerable reluctance in the silence that follows. Given that silence plays such a large role at the end of the discussion, it may not be at all apparent, in the first sense, what is the proportion of support for the viewpoint being proposed as the consensus position. All that's apparent in the transparency sense is that the position faces no further vocal objection. As he writes, there's no systematic expression of the preferences of the participants, no counting of their opinions, and thus there's possible ignorance of the distribution of these opinions at the end of the process. In more recent work, Orfolino has adopted the term non-opposition rule for this kind of procedure, which brings to mind the venerable, many centuries old idea of nemine contradicente, without objection. One finds throughout the history of politics, things like be it resolved, nemine contradicente, without objection, that. As for why the reluctant members of a deliberating group would cease to press their personal opinions and lines of reason, leaving others in the dark as to the distribution of viewpoints among them, I'll get to that shortly. The philosopher Margaret Gilbert, entirely independently and using fictive but realistic everyday examples like parents arguing about or debating rules for their children's behavior, has proposed a similar sort of deliberative process that she calls joint acceptance. And according to Gilbert, a group jointly accepts P, some proposition P, for example, global warming is largely due to human activities, if and only if the individual members have openly agreed among themselves to let that proposition stand as the position of the group. They've agreed to let P stand as the position of the group, in other words, though not necessarily as their own personal position. Joint acceptance of a position is consistent with considerable disagreement among group members. What Gilbert's term joint acceptance helpfully emphasizes is the collective versus merely aggregative aspect of this form of decision procedure. The group's position is P, not by virtue of all the members holding that P, nor by virtue of a majority, nor any other particular proportion of the members holding that P. Gilbert might well have invoked Dorff and Steiner's findings in this regard. Of the 170 debates, political debates that they studied that were decided by interpretation, in 85 of these, the proposal that won had been supported by the majority of the vocal discussants, not by a vote. This is just the investigators themselves tallying how many people are arguing on one side of the issue or another. In 19 of the debates, the proposal that won had been supported by a minority of the discussants. And in the remaining 66 cases, there had been equal numbers of supporters among the discussants before one position was proposed as the consensus and its detractors did not contest it further until they got to the pub anyway. Now, having argued that no objection and let stand decisions by a group are not reducible to tallies of the personal viewpoints of the group members, it's wonderful to me to acknowledge Stephanie Novak's remarkable study of the Council of the European Union, the most important legislative body within the Union. There are circumstances under which a qualified majority of council delegates is required to support a proposal. But the president of the council has the discretion to employ a no objection rule, a no objection form of consensus, in order to satisfy the majority criterion, even without taking a vote to see if there's a majority. And this turns out to be the norm, Novak reports, in the council's plenary meetings. And it's considered so reasonable within the council that some delegates report to Novak, without any sincerity or attempt to deceive, that they vote all the time, even though they hardly vote at all. And I'll return to this case. So they're mixing up their procedure with a voting majority procedure. Now, perhaps another reason why a no objection decision might be mistaken for a vote has to do with the pretty crucial, seemingly crucial similarity between it, and not just a vote, but to a unanimity vote in particular. And that is, in both cases, the nemine contra dissente case, no objection case, and also the unanimity case, the decision is hostage to something like the veto power of a single party, which means it's vulnerable to the errors, blinders, biases, and caprice of one member, the one member who doesn't vote for, with all the rest, if it's a tally, or the one member who keeps objecting in a nemine contra dissente case. This is one of the main reasons why unanimity rules are rightly scorned in so many settings. Might no objection procedures face the same vulnerability? But veto power and objection power turn out to be importantly different. For to voice an objection is very different from simply voting no. An objection in a no objection proceeding comes with a reason, which puts an objector in a much more difficult situation than a mere naysayer, which in turn is related to the perspective of some of those who study no objection procedures. Their view that these kinds of procedures are preferred in situations where there's a strong sense that what's being sought is a judgment and not just a survey of preferences among the members. And that while voting may be fine to determine whose preferences are to be honored, it's not fine when it comes to judging, say, the common good or the way the world works. Another way that this is put is that no objection procedures are considered more suitable when political and or epistemic individualism and equality are not paramount. While it's crucial for all members of the group to have access to the deliberation, in these cases, it's argued, it's not considered important for everyone's view to be tallied and weighted equally in making the final decision. There is a sense that this would not contribute to the quality of the decision at hand. In these sorts of situations, there may arise a point, after much back and forth in the discussion, where dissenters realize that they've been heard by other reasonable people, but have been found unconvincing. Continued objection would not only be a waste of time, but also counterproductive for the dissenter as well as for the group. As ethnologist Emmanuel Touré suggests in connection with the village meeting, anyone who thinks he can continue to oppose the emerging consensus position reveals by his very opposition that he prefers his personal interest to the general interest. Or as Orfolino describes the situation of the French Drug Evaluation Committee, imagine an expert who's been free to object to a proposal made by the head of the committee on whether or not to approve market sale of a given drug. His objections have already been discussed collectively. Some of them have been integrated into the consensus proposal in the making, while others have been opposed on the basis of arguments that seem to have convinced the other participants. If this expert continues to express opposition to the proposal as reformulated by the chair, using arguments similar to those that have already been refuted, he'll provoke surprise and disapproval. His commitment to the decision he favors will seem excessive and suspect. His stubbornness is considered inappropriate precisely because he's behaving as if his position were worth something as such as his position, whereas its value is, as explained, indexed on the strength and success of his argument. Now, another possible reason why a no objection decision might be mistaken for a vote, and again, a unanimity or near unanimity vote in particular, has to do with the similar authorizing functions that they serve. For better or worse, disagreement undermines the claim of a group to deference of others outside the group. And I've argued elsewhere that this shouldn't be the case. Some scholars in my area, science and technology studies, argue that it should. In any case, who doubts that it does? That lack of unanimity undermines the authority of the non-unanimous group. When decision makers are split, those impacted by the decision have or feel they have or claim they have less reason to defer to it. How well-grounded could the majority position be if other reasonable decision makers were publicly opposed to it? Is there, after all, any more important or more common role for consensus statements in governance or in science than that of winning deference to the consensus position? And I'd even suggest that function is bound up with the very meaning of consensus statement. And here I'm building on the work of rhetorician Jean Goodwin. And let me propose, just for target's sake, that a consensus statement reports some form of consensus within a group to outsiders in order to morally impel their deference to the agreed upon position. In the case of scientific consensus statements, the moral compulsion works by communicating the idea that failure to defer is imprudent. Surely this is the point of these 97% infographics that we see so often. As political psychologist Daniel Kahn remarked in this essay, the point of these messages is to challenge the intransigent with, "Do you get it yet, moron?" Or as he puts it in the Scientific American essay that appeared on the Scientific American essay on the 97% paper controversy, the 97%, it's a bumper sticker, and it says, "Fuck you" on it. And actually there are bumper stickers that say 97%, as well as bumper stickers that have the implicit message made explicit. Now, to the extent that no objection procedures lead to quality judgments, and not just accurate surveys of preferences, then we have all the more reason to defer to them. But they would serve to compel deference in a very different way than a unanimity vote. Namely, by affirming not that all or most of the deliberators support the position in question, but only that none of them continued to voice an objection. And the question that I worry about is whether a no objection consensus compels deference precisely by obscuring the epistemic state of play within the deciding group rather than clarifying it. A pointed question to ask in this regard is why not take a vote? Why not report the proportion of individual deliberators who personally affirm the consensus position? Hopefully the answer to this question would not simply be to compel deference in a situation where a vote would undermine deference. I mentioned at the outset my concern to distinguish more collective forms of consensus from more aggregative forms that they may be mistaken for. And to this end, I think it's worth considering the case of the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, whose results are typically communicated in terms of numbers like this: the 2007 overall report of all 3 working groups reports, and the statement for lawmakers, reporting these kinds of numbers. Here's the second working group's report from last year. You see the numbers at the bottom here. And I conducted an altogether unscientific study, and I took these sorts of numbers down to my local coffee shop and pub on Commercial Drive, and I just asked my neighbors there what they made of these numbers. And those that had an opinion believed that this many people and this many countries affirmed the conclusions of the IPCC reports. And it's worth discussing how far from reality this perception is. And I want to stress 2 points, and I'll just state them now and then elaborate on them. The most important point here for me today is that whatever these numbers are supposed to reflect, they don't reflect affirmative votes. There's no voting in the IPCC. Second, there's no meaningful consensus of any sort involving all the authors and reviewers involved in an IPCC assessment, nor even all the authors involved in one of the component reports. So first, I should just briefly describe, maybe just remind you of some very basic information about IPCC assessment reports. And there have been important changes to the procedures, but unless I say so, I'm talking about the way things are done now, or at least were done in the case of last year's report. An IPCC assessment report consists of minimally of the reports of 3 working groups. You can see their titles, their subject matters here. And a 4th report, the so-called summary for policymakers, which includes the most noteworthy results from each working group in language accessible to a broader audience. So much for overall structure. As for procedures, the first item under procedures in the principles governing IPCC work, that document, reads, "In taking decisions and approving, adopting, and accepting reports, the panel, its working groups, and any task forces shall use all best endeavors to reach consensus." That's where I got stuck earlier on in my efforts to make sense of what's going on. As for the sorts of procedures and outcomes that would count as consensus, there's no elaboration except for the references to approval, adoption, and acceptance. So we might look to see, well, what do those mean? And I'll just discuss approval and acceptance. According to the procedures for the preparation, review, acceptance, adoption, approval of publication of IPCC reports, acceptance pertains to working group reports, and it signifies that the accepted material has not been subject to line-by-line discussion and agreement, but nevertheless presents a comprehensive, objective, and balanced view of the subject matter. Approval pertains to the IPCC plenary, its activities, and in particular, the summary for policymakers, and it signifies that the material has been subject to detailed line-by-line discussion and agreement. However, in neither case is it specified whether a vote is taken or whether some sort of no objection procedure is employed or what. The only way to find out what's going on is by talking to the participants and asking them what they do. We're lucky at UBC to have had people playing important roles in the authorship of these kinds of documents. As for the participants, just to remind you, working group members are appointed from a pool of nominees. There's 4 kinds of members: lead authors, who have the expertise to take charge of particular topics that will be represented by chapters in a group's report, and coordinating lead authors who oversee the entire working group's report. There are also contributing authors for each topic or chapter. They fill in areas of expertise not covered by the lead authors. The contributing authors do not participate in accepting the report. That's done by the lead authors and the coordinating lead authors. The fourth category of members is review editors, and I'll get to their role shortly. Each working group report goes through 3 drafts, first order draft, second order draft, and the final draft. The first draft is made available to invited and also now self-registered experts, and the second draft is available again to expert reviewers as well as to government delegations, and the third draft is final. One of the many remarkable aspects of the 2-step review process has to do with the review editors that I just mentioned, who don't contribute to the writing of the report, but rather whose sole task is to ensure that reviewers' comments, suggestions, and criticisms are satisfactorily responded to. This is clearly a quantity issue, but what concerns me just right now is the transparency aspect of this. The first and second drafts and all the comments and replies, so in the case of the second working group, for example, all 48,000 comments and replies are made available for public scrutiny. This is just incredible transparency. And I stress it partly because it contrasts so strikingly with the opacity of the IPCC in these other respects that concern me, like what is consensus. At any rate, the lead and contributing authors of a chapter revise their drafts with the comments in mind, having to satisfy each other in the process. Again, no votes are taken. There are no yays and nays. The closest thing to a nay is an objection, which has to come with a reason, until finally there aren't any. As a lead author told me, it's not a formal process. We discussed and debated and incrementally revised the text until everyone was happy with it. And obviously I need to follow up with the meaning of happy. One wonders whether debates that end in a meeting room might continue at the pub, as in the Steiner and Dorff study. Everyone's happiness in the end might signal that persistent individual disagreement aside, the outcome was more satisfying than a vote, echoing the idea that no objection procedures tend to be adopted in cases where there's a strong sense that what's being sought is a sound judgment and not just a preference. But to raise the question again, if everyone is indeed happy, then why not take a vote? Why wouldn't it be better to report unanimous affirmation if unanimous affirmation existed? Why not strive in any case to present the range of viewpoints within the group? It might also be the case that the participants don't recognize a major difference between the sort of no further objection procedure that they follow and a vote. They may see the former as an informal version of the latter, much as the delegates to the Council of the European Union think they're voting when they're not. Now, for the sake of time, I'll leave out discussion of the evaluation of the summary for policymakers and just point out again, it's done on a line-by-line basis, but that consensus is not a matter of taking a vote line by line. And again, I just want to pose the question, why not vote? Why not communicate the range of individual viewpoints that exist at the time that the deliberation ceases? Now, my second point about the IPCC decision procedures was that there's no meaningful consensus of any kind involving the sorts of numbers that so commonly accompany the release and promotion of IPCC assessments. In this regard, let me quote climate scientist Mike Hulme, who was himself an author involved in the second and third assessment. Without a careful explanation about what it means, this drive for consensus can leave the IPCC vulnerable to outside criticism. Claims such as 2,500 of the world's leading scientists have reached a consensus that human activities are having a significant influence on the climate are disingenuous. That particular consensus judgment, as are many others in the IPCC reports, is actually reached by only a few dozen experts in the specific field of detection and attribution study. So put 2,500 aside, substitute for it mainly, at least with regard to this claim, maybe a dozen, couple dozen. Now, how could that be? What could that possibly mean? This is the sort of thing he's referring to. Here's the title page of Chapter 10 of the Physical Sciences Working Group on Detection and Attribution of Climate Change. And you can't read them, but you can see the second section has the number of lead authors. These are the number of people that are accepting this particular chapter. As the quotation from Hume continues, all the other IPCC authors are experts in other fields that these authors are not experts in. So for instance, my lead author acquaintance was responsible for the chapter on ocean systems in the Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability Working Group. Authors of that working group do not accept the report of the Physical Science Working Group, in which the Attribution and Detection chapter appears. Only authors of the Physical Science Working Group participate in accepting that group's report. And moreover, often or usually, the authors of one chapter in a working group report are not in a position to object with reason to the conclusions of the authors in another chapter, even in the same report. On what grounds could a lead author of the Ocean Systems chapter really object to the conclusions of the Terrestrial and Inland Water Systems chapter of the same report, much less the Urban Areas chapter? And I could go further on this point, but I won't for time's sake. The point is just to emphasize that the numbers of people in the position to object with reason are far smaller than the sorts of numbers associated with the release and promotion of IPCC assessment reports. So in conclusion, I've been concerned here to point out that consensus is not always equivalent to personal affirmation, and in fact can be consistent with an unknown and possibly considerable amount of individual disagreement. Such forms of consensus building have this epistemological drawback, at least for those of us on the outside trying to look in, that they leave ambiguous, but even for the deliberators themselves, they leave ambiguous the range of viewpoints of the group of deliberators, and where they stand at the end of personally stand at the end of the discussion. On the other hand, they seem, at least to many of those that practice and study them, to have epistemological virtues that voting does not have, again, ending in a judgment as opposed to a survey of preferences. Of course, one could combine the procedures to aim for a no objection form of consensus before proceeding to a vote for epistemological transparency's sake. The IPCC is so concerned about transparency. Recall the way in which they make available the first and second drafts, and each and every comment and criticism and each and every response of the review editors. Why then are the IPCC's procedures, which strongly emphasize consensus as the primary goal, as opaque as they are with regard to how consensus is to be arrived at? There's two levels of ambiguity here. First, ambiguity with respect to procedures, which do not specify that the consensus procedure to be employed is a no objection form. And outsiders would not be remiss, my neighbors, I would say, are not remiss for thinking that something more like individual affirmation by large numbers of experts is the actual procedure. And then secondly, there's the ambiguity that no objection procedures typically result in regarding the distribution of viewpoints among the participants. And so I'll end with just two questions. One, why doesn't the IPCC vote? And my worrying concern, is it possible that that sort of information would undermine the IPCC's de facto authority or its legitimate authority? And two, what would happen if the IPCC announced its findings in something like the following manner? Resolved, nemine contradicente that. Now, there'd be lots of questions. What in the world does nemine contradicente mean? And so on. So there'd have to be some explanation. And anticipating that, the IPCC procedures might make clear that no votes are taken. What would be the impact of that? No, stop there. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much, John. So we've got plenty of time for questions, and as always, we'll start off with public speaking. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think the IPCC could certainly make clear that the numbers that they use in releasing these are not votes, first of all. And they could make clear that even if there were votes, that they were votes among the lead authors and coordinating authors, and not every scientist whose material was taken into account. Those are things the IPCC could make clear. So it's not out of the question that they could still vote, even though it's clearly out of the question that they could muster a vote among all the different authors of all the different reports that they're taking seriously. That would be another thing to add, yeah, right. And that would be interesting to know too. I mean, I think that would contribute to the authority of the IPCC, those large numbers. But as long as it's not understood to be personal affirmation by that many people. But, my phone just buzzed. Sorry, so let me try and turn it off. Okay, I hope it's off. Right. I think that we, including scientists and the science and technology studies community, have really shot ourselves in the foot by promoting a view of science as objective in the following sense: that if left to their own devices, not influenced by politics or wishful thinking or anything, scientists would come to unanimous consensus on any issue, as opposed to philosophers, as opposed to theologians, as opposed to politicians. And so, as a result of that kind of view of the objectivity of science, that they do come to agreement if there's no outside influence, I think people are reasonably worried about deferring when they find that there's no consensus, and go looking for some reason for why that should be the case. And I've argued elsewhere that I don't think 100% or even 97% should be what we're aiming for when trying to get deference from the general public. It should be that we should make arguments for deference from the general public based on the procedures that are being followed and not the tally at the end. Obviously, if it's 40% in favor of anthropogenic climate change rather than some higher number than 50, that's going to be a problem. But this idea that we have to aim for a high number and anything short of it leaves people in a quandary about what to do, I think that's what we should be fighting against, that it is a particular view of objectivity, that scientists can agree where other people can't. Science is objective where other fields aren't. And I think that, yeah, that's the problem. We should be attacking that, I think. Because, again, these consensus statements, they worry me. You know, I think that this political psychologist at Harvard who's been studying the 97% phenomenon, namely, it's not working, right? The bumper sticker's not working. If anything, it pisses people off. And there's just got to be another way to appeal other than saying that, you know, we're smart, we came up with this high consensus, and just defer. So when my colleague Naomi Oreskes said, you know, we shouldn't be trying to prove it to them, just show them how many of you agree. I don't know, that kind of worries me. The authority of science kind of run amok there. But on the other hand, what I'm interested in is ways to legitimate scientific authority, because I know I need to defer, and I think we need to defer, but we need to think more about the criteria for deferring.
Faculty, what's your question here?
Right, so I'm in a bad position, or I'm not in anything like the position that Stephanie Novak is in studying the European Council, or that Philippe Orfolino is in, who's been allowed to attend the meetings of the French Drug Acceptance Committee. Steiner and Dorff, what they were able to do, what's crucial about being in these settings is that you, even though no vote is taken, you can, as the investigator, can tally how many people are speaking in favor of one position rather than another. And that's really crucial. And then following them to the bar is just, you know, that's ingenious as well as fun research. And seeing that the debates continue to go on. And none of this is apparent in the documents. Orfolino, Novak, I'm not sure about Steiner and Dorff, they all follow up their reports based on their presence with interview questions. So yeah, they have so much more information than we currently have. It would have been really nice if early on in the establishment of the IPCC, and Mike Hulme is the kind of person who might have thought to do this, it was set up as an experiment in consensus. And if there had been sociologists, anthropologists there to study what was going on, it's really too bad there wasn't. But it might have been concerns about whether people would agree to participate under circumstances like that. It's always an issue. One of the people I've been talking to was for many years, through many reports, a member of the Dutch delegation. And he also had a major role on the procedures committees and changes in the procedures. And you know, he said, yes, I assure you there are no votes taken, which is good to hear. When I asked him why he thought that was the case, he suggested, well, he'd never really thought about it. But, you know, reminded me that this is the UN IPCC, and the UN's a diplomatic organization, and that votes are divisive. And so something like that might be going on. We have this hybrid diplomatic scientific organization, that's living by diplomatic rules and maybe not the kinds of rules that scientists would choose if it was just their thing.
Any other questions? I have one actually. So I've largely encountered participation in consensus in the context of dispute management reforms, and often there are a lot of concerns around marginalisation of voices. And I was wondering, in the context of science and these types of studies around resisting or European Council processes, whether similar concerns around marginalisation of some voices.
There should be, because silence is not a very good indicator of people's points of view. And some people are silent because they're marginalized, or they're silent because they don't have the confidence because of their position in the room or their position in society. And even people who have positions of considerable respect are sometimes silent under certain circumstances. One of the saddest cases of a kind of nemine contradicente decision had to do with the Challenger disaster. And this case may be known to many of you, that supposedly the O-rings failed. And the O-rings had been a point of concern for Roger Bajali. I can't remember his last name now exactly. And he was an engineer at the engineering company that was responsible for these. And he'd been voicing concerns about the behavior of the O-ring under certain circumstances. And he raised these objections at meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting. And then finally, at the end, in a kind of a televised conference, he didn't speak up anymore. And there was the disaster. And he has had a hard time explaining why he didn't speak up anymore. He was a respected engineer who specialized in this kind of thing. If he didn't speak up, and the regret felt by him and the scorn heaped on him for his silence is incredible. If he didn't speak up, what are other people who feel they're in epistemically disadvantageous positions, or who are going to be not taken seriously anyway? What are they going to think? So I didn't talk about some of the other downsides of relying on silence, but silence is not a good indicator of much.
Anything further? Otherwise, please join me in thanking Professor John Beatty once more.
Thank you. Watch A Man for All Seasons, and watch Cromwell's examination of Sir Thomas More concerning his silence when asked if he supported the king. It's absolutely fabulous. And then you'll be very wary about relying on silence in the future.